Well, let me tell you about our next speaker. I debated on what I should say, and I asked him, I said, well, what do you want me to say in your introduction? He said, well, keep it short. So I'm going to keep it short. I have known this person has known me my entire life. He has been called many things: counselor, captain, prosecutor, judge, senator, congressman. Some people even now refer to him as governor. I'm lucky to call him Daddy. The 82nd governor of Georgia, Nathan Deal.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks to all of you for inviting Jason's mother, Sandra, and I to be with you today. I want to begin by saying something that I try to say as often as possible to those of you who work in this very important area, and that is thank you for what you do. I know it's a difficult job. I know you are bucking the mindset of a lot of people in the work that you do, but it is worth it. As Judge Stevens said, the most common comment that I hear, and I think most of you in the system of accountability courts hear, is something to the effect of, drug court saved my life. So, what greater calling could you have than to help save people's lives? I tell my preacher friends that if they ever run out of sermon material, they should attend a drug court graduation. They will have plenty of material to last for a very long time. And quite frankly, the content would be better than what some of them preach about every Sunday. It would have a whole lot more impact in practical terms about what changes the dynamic of our society. So, thank you. Now let me talk to you a little bit about from a historical perspective. And first, before I do that, though, let me congratulate the Council of Accountability Court Judges for hosting this event today. It's the first one you've hosted. Of course, you've only been in existence since July of last year, so I assume you're going to carry on this tradition. With the turnout that you have represented here, I think there's a demand for it, and I thank you for being willing to be the undertaking of the sponsorship of it. Let me take you back a little bit in time. And it doesn't take going back that far for me to demonstrate why I think what you're doing is so important. When I took office in January of 2011, we were in the midst of a crisis in our criminal justice system. Our prison population had doubled in the past 2 decades. It was right at 56,000 people. I was told that we could expect another 8% increase in that to 60,000 by the end of my first term, and that I was going to need to build 2 new adult prisons to house some 5,000 more adult prisoners in our system, and it was going to cost about $264 million. That was one of the 2 most shocking statements that I was told that first week after I was elected governor. To think that that's where you're going to have to spend taxpayers' money. And we were still in the recession, folks, as you may recall, in 2011. Coming up with that kind of extra money to build prisons was not a very exciting undertaking for a new governor. The second most disturbing, and maybe it was the first most disturbing actually, statement that I was told was, well, Governor, you know that rainy day fund that we are all so proud of? We got enough money in there to operate state government for 2 days. That's a pretty disconcerting thing to tell a new governor. But I have good news for you, and you probably read it in the press this week. We now have accumulated over $2 billion in our state rainy day fund. But we still, that's been due to the hard work and cooperation of the members of the General Assembly. And there may be members of the General Assembly who are here in the audience today. If they are, let me extend to them my thanks for what they have done to make all of this possible, because you just don't have these things occur on their own. It requires people to get to work. In my first State of the State address in 2011, I observed that we had a problem with criminal justice in this state, that we had about 1 out of every 13 Georgians that were under some form of either incarceration or supervision, that it was costing us the amount of money I have previously talked about with no end in sight in terms of slowing things down, that we had a recidivism rate of about 30% of adults and 65% of juveniles coming back after they've been released, coming back into the system within a 3-year period, and that we had a real problem. Now, although those were facts that were not really secret facts, sometimes we don't, as a people or as individuals, want to confront those kind of statistics because they are so big and so overwhelming that the best thing to do is just ignore them and keep them out of your mind. So I knew that we had a task on our hand if we were going to change the direction of this state in criminal justice. I decided the best way to do that was to appoint a council to undertake recommendations and to come back to the General Assembly with those recommendations. And I want to thank publicly Judge Michael Boggs for his leadership in serving as the co-chair of that council. Thomas Worthy had been the other co-chair. Thomas has taken I'm sure a lucrative job in private business and left us at the state level, and I wish him well. And we replaced Thomas with Kerry Miller, and I gave Kerry the day off. I went to his wedding yesterday, Sandra and I did, so we told him, don't worry about this meeting on Monday, we'll cover it for you. But to those of you, and there are some probably in the audience today who were part of this overall Criminal Justice Reform Council, thank you for what you have done, the hard work you have put in place to make recommendations. And as you know, your recommendations have been an ongoing process. And your recommendations, when they are presented by my office to the General Assembly, have been overwhelmingly supported by the General Assembly. In fact, those first 2 years, they were supported unanimously in the House and the Senate. I've often said, I can't think of much of anything that ever passes the Georgia General Assembly unanimously, but the accountability courts, of which we are here to talk about today, in that first year passed unanimously. The juvenile reforms in the second year passed unanimously. And almost every recommendation that the council has made have been supported, with only 1 or 2 that objected. Generally, there were 1 or 2 that was vote no on anything. And a couple of those found out that that was not the popular thing to do. And I remember in the year after they voted against the third proposal, which was our in-prison reforms, I know 2 of my Republican colleagues got beat in the Republican primary. So sometimes it pays to be on the right side of history. You're on the right side of history today. Now, I don't have to tell you that there is savings to be had by keeping people out of $19,000 to $20,000 a year prison beds, but we still have work to do. We have a number of accountability courts and alternative courts across our state, but we need to have more. And we need to have a greater saturation within our state so that you have the capacity to afford all of those who qualify for your programs the opportunity to do so, and not just a very special few. But you're doing well with what you have had made available to you. We've had the outside help of, in the juvenile area in particular, the Annie Casey Foundation and many others. The reentry programs have been a huge success. They are things that we will continue to work on because it doesn't do much good if your recidivism rate remains high and you literally have the revolving door, and that's why that work is so important. As a passing thought, when we did a survey of our prison population, the most common characteristic, and you've heard me say this before, the most common characteristic of those who are locked up in our prison cells was they dropped out of school. So, when I say that education reform is the ultimate criminal justice reform, I have the facts to back it up. So, we started on the tail end of the system, admittedly. We started with those who were already in trouble with the law. Wouldn't it be nice if we could stop it and change the trajectory of young people's lives so that they never get in the system in the first place? It would not only save them, their families, the heartache that is associated with criminal conduct, it would save innocent Georgians who are the victims of the crimes that they commit that get them in the system in the first place. So we got a lot of work to do. Just in passing, I hope that you will support the constitutional amendment. It'll be proposition number 1 on the ballot to create an opportunity school district. I believe that's a real chance for us to do something about those chronically failing schools, the worst of the worst, those that for 3 or more consecutive years have failed to make above a 60. You got an F for 3 or more consecutive years. It's time for the state to have the authority to intervene and change that dynamic. Now, if you don't think that's a problem because you live and your children go to school in school systems that don't have chronically failing schools, I'm glad you don't have that problem. But the truth of the matter is there are almost 68,000 children and their parents who are required by law to attend chronically failing schools. And those chronically failing schools have a graduation rate that is 23 percentage points below the average graduation rate in our state. It is so low that it's almost 1 out of every 2 will not graduate from high school. So I think it is an important thing for us to be doing. And with your help at the ballot box in November, I guarantee you that we will do our best to make that reform as effective as the criminal justice reforms that we have made over these last several years. One of the other reforms that we made was something just to streamline the process of the way we dealt with those who were in the system. For years, I think judges and others had advocated that there needed to be a better process of consolidating functions. I think General Assemblies and previous governors had tried to bring things together because we had duplication sometimes of efforts where you had a probation officer who was supervising a person and they were also on parole supervision and a lot of overlap. We created the Department of Community Supervision, and the director, Michael Nails, is over here with us today. Thank you, Michael, for what you and your people do. They are working very hard, and all the reports that I'm getting is that they have really been able to bring all of these elements together from the Department of Corrections, the State Board of Pardons and Paroles, and the Department of Juvenile Justice. That is a big undertaking, and I thank all of you, if any of you else are involved in that process. Now, back to where we were, one of the first things that I heard from most law enforcement officers, especially sheriffs, when I was campaigning for governor in 2010, was, Governor, what are you going to do about that backlog of prisoners in my local jail? They are overrunning my jail, and y'all need to take them off my hands because they're state prisoners. They're not local prisoners anymore. The judges sentenced them, and they're in the state system. Now, in fiscal year 2009, the state paid approximately $25 million to local counties to keep state prisoners in their local jails because we didn't have any room for them in the state system. $25 million in 2009. In the current fiscal year, that is down to about $5,000. A huge change. I tease some of my sheriff friends and I say, I don't hear you talking about that jail overcrowding anymore. And I know secretly that what they're having to do is explain to their county commissioners why they convinced the county to build these big jails that they don't have anybody sitting in the cells. But I'd rather have that problem than the other way around. Those are just a few of the things that I think all of us are hopefully fairly familiar with that have gone on historically and are continuing to go forward. I want to share with you, though, something that is an area of concern. And I do so by reference to a New York Times article that appeared 10 days ago on September the 2nd. And this is an article that is looking at the disparity between sentences that are given to individuals based on the geography of where they get in trouble. And I'm going to read a few quotes out of it. I think they're interesting. Just a decade ago, people in rural, suburban, and urban areas were all about equally likely to go to prison. But now people in small counties are about 50% more likely to go to prison than people in populous counties. Now, it goes on to say that rural areas, mostly white and politically conservative counties, have continued to send more drug offenders to prison, reflecting the changing geography of addiction. While crack cocaine addiction was centered in cities, opioid and meth addiction are ravaging small communities. And then this is the call that we should all be aware of. And it quotes an individual who is the executive director of the Prison Policy Institute, which is an institute that is advocating for reducing prison incarceration. He says this. He talks about this data of the inequity between urban sentences and rural sentences. And he says this. This data puts governors and legislative leaders on notice that if they want to put criminal justice reforms into effect, they need to look at how prosecutors use and abuse their discretion. I don't necessarily agree with all of those words, but I do think that we all need to be aware that there will be those who will continue to ask the question, why is there a disparity about what sentence I will receive if I am caught in an urban area versus caught in a rural area? Now, I would remind you, and I know that Judge Stevens is old enough because he and I served in the General Assembly many years ago at the same time. As we were in those days going through the let's get tough on crime scenario, one of the reasons that mandatory minimum sentences were put in place was because there were some judges, mostly in the larger metropolitan communities, that were giving very lenient sentences on offenses that, if committed elsewhere in the state, would receive harsh sentences. So therefore, we tied the judge's hands. We said the minimum you can give for this offense is so many years, etc. I wonder, and this is just wondering, are we rapidly approaching a time when the people of this state will call on the General Assembly and all of us to say, it's time that we do something about these inequitable sentences that so differently vary based on your location? Now, what is the point of me talking to you about a New York Times article? I usually don't cite the New York Times. Usually no more than I cite the AJC. But the point is one worth considering. And it's one I think we should all pay attention to. But we are doing something about it. Those of you in this room today can do something about that inequity, because many of you work in the rural areas of our state. Now, that is why, in my opinion, it is so important that in those rural districts that we have, that our accountability courts be provided in greater amount than what we are currently providing. Those lucky few who get selected are very fortunate because they go into your courts. But if we leave too many of those who are in the same conditions, meet the same criteria, but they are not given a chance, a second chance, through an accountability court, sooner or later, the public is going to catch on. Now, we as a state have not published something that other states do publish, and it deals with this very statistic. Some states publish what percentage of a county's population is being sent into the state prison system. Some of you who have a little bit closer knowledge to that subject than I do, perhaps, will know that if that were published, there would be some judicial circuits in this state that would probably have some hard questions to have to answer. You can eliminate those hard questions, and the officials in those circuits can eliminate those hard questions if they will embrace accountability courts, if they will make sure that as many people as possible that qualify are given that second chance. Is it hard work? Absolutely. You all know that better than I do. It is hard work, but the rewards are tremendous. It's not just those that walk up to you and say, "This court saved my life." It is the children that are reunited with parents that have been lost to addiction. It is the families that have been brought together that because of the addiction of one of the family members can't even get together on Christmas or Thanksgiving because of the conduct of one of those members in the past. And nobody had found a way to bring them back into the fold. You do that. And that is not only rewarding work, it is beneficial to our society as a whole. So I'm really here today to do as I said in the beginning, to simply say thank you for what you do. We've spent about $48 million, I think, of state money, and we've had several million more that have come in from the federal government for us to make these alternative programs available in our state. It is your cooperation, it is your work, it is your dedication to a difficult task that has brought the prison population numbers down now, even though our state has grown from the 10th largest population state to the 8th largest population state. Our prison population that was supposed to be 60,000 is now down to about 52,000. And by the way, we didn't have to build those 2 new prisons. We've actually been able to close facilities and turn them into transition centers. And the same thing has been true in our juvenile justice system. So, thank you, and keep up the good work.